My name is Peter Anderson, founder of The Playful Couple. Welcome to the Relationship Pathway, where each journey begins with one courageous step into the unknown. Let's have a look at why in relationships behaviors keep repeating themselves, caught in a frustrating loop. Why does this keep happening? The same kind of moment, the same kind of feeling, the same kind of outcome. Even when the situation is different, even when the people are different, something about it feels familiar. And you might not always see it clearly, but you can feel it. That sense of, I've been here before. And it doesn't always show up in obvious ways. Like sometimes it's in conversations that turn in the same direction. Sometimes it's in moments where something small becomes something bigger, and sometimes it's quieter than that, and in a distance you can't quite explain, in a disconnection that seems to appear without a clear reason, in things not quite landing the way you hoped they would. And part of you might try to understand it, to work out what's going on or why this keeps repeating. And another part of you might just feel it. That weight, that frustration, that quiet sense that something isn't shifting. Even when you try, even when you do things differently. And this is where it becomes confusing, because on the surface, things do change. Different conversations, different days, different intentions, and you might say something new. You might approach things differently. You might even feel like you're trying harder. But underneath, something stays the same, and it's that part that's harder to see, because it doesn't sit in what's obvious. It sits in how things feel as they unfold. And you might notice that there are moments where you can almost predict what's about to happen. Not in detail, not word for word, but in direction. You can feel where something is going before it gets there. And that feeling is subtle but strong. It's like something in you is already leaning towards an outcome before anything has fully played out. And sometimes you might try to stop it. Say something differently, hold something back, adjust your tone, choose your words more carefully. And for a moment it might feel different. But then something shifts and you find yourself back in something familiar. And that can leave you with a question. Is it them? Is it me? Is it just how things are? And none of those answers quite settle it, because the experience is still there. And that's the part that stays with you. Not the detail, not the specific moment, but the feeling of it, the sense that something is repeating in a way you can't quite name. And this doesn't just show up in one place. Like you might notice it in different relationships, different environments, different stages of your life. And even when everything looks different, something underneath feels the same. And that's where it becomes harder to ignore, because it's not tied to one situation. It follows you in a way that's subtle but consistent. And this is where most people begin. Not with clarity, not with understanding, but with a feeling that something is repeating, and not knowing why. And that question, why this keeps happening, is often the first place where something begins to open. And once you begin to notice that something else often follows, you start to try to change it. Not always in a big way, not always consciously, but in small adjustments. You say things differently. You choose your words more carefully. You hold things back. You soften your tone, or sometimes you do the opposite. You become clearer, more direct, more certain. You decide this time it's going to be different. And for a moment it can feel like it is, and the conversation goes another way. The moment doesn't escalate, things seem calmer, more contained, and there's a sense that maybe something has shifted. But then at another time, in another moment, something very similar happens again. Not exactly the same, not in the same words, but in the same direction. And that's where it begins to feel confusing. Because now it's not just happening, you're trying not to let it happen, and still something about it finds its way back. And that can create a different kind of feeling, Not just frustration, but doubt. Am I doing something wrong? Am I missing something? Or maybe it leads somewhere else. Maybe you begin to think this is just how it is, this is just how relationships are, this is just how people are, this is just how I am. And each of those thoughts settles in a different way because they all point to something that can't really change. And that can feel heavy. Because if that's true, then what's the point of trying? And yet something in you keeps trying anyway, because there's also a part of you that knows this isn't how it has to be. Even if you don't know how to change it, you can feel that something isn't quite right. And this is where many people get stuck, in between those two places. The part that tries and the part that starts to give up. The part that hopes and the part that feels like nothing really shifts. And in that space, it's easy to turn towards what's visible. The other person, their behavior, what they said, what they didn't say, because that's where it seems like the problem is, and sometimes that's where all the focus goes. If they changed, this would be different. If they listened, this wouldn't happen. If they understood, this would stop. And those thoughts make sense, because from the outside, that's what it looks like. But even when those things shift, even when someone listens more, even when something improves, the feeling can still return. And that's the part that's harder to explain, because it suggests that what's happening isn't only about what's visible. It isn't only about what's being said or done. There's something else moving underneath it. And that's what keeps bringing things back to a similar place. And this is where you might start to notice that the pattern doesn't just live in the situation, it's when it moves with you, in the way you feel, in the way you respond, in the way something lands. And that's not something most people are taught to look at. So instead they keep adjusting the surface, trying new words, new approaches, new ways of communicating. And sometimes those things help for a while. But they don't quite reach what keeps repeating, and that's where the question deepens. Not just why does this happen, but what is it that keeps returning even when things change on the outside? And this is where something begins to shift. Not in what's happening, but in where you start to look. Because up until now, everything has been focused on what's visible. Because that's what you can see, that's what you can point to, that's what you can name. But if you stay with the question just a little longer, what is it that keeps returning, you might begin to notice something else. That the feeling doesn't start in the situation, it's touched by the situation, but it doesn't begin there. And that's a subtle difference, but an important one, because it means that what you feel in that moment is not only about what's happening now, it's connected to something else, something that's already there. And this can be hard to see at first, because the moment feels so immediate, so real, so clearly linked to what just happened. But if you slow it down just slightly, you might notice that the feeling arrives very quickly, before you've had time to think about it, before you've had time to understand it. And it's just there. And once it's there, everything else begins to organize around it. So your thoughts, your interpretation, your response, and it all feels connected to the moment. But the speed of it is a clue, because it suggests that something in you already knows that feeling. It's not being created from nothing, and it's being activated. And once you begin to notice that, something changes in how you see it. Because now, instead of asking why did they do that, or why did this happen, another question starts to appear. What is it about this moment that touches something in me? And that question doesn't have an immediate answer. It's not something you can think your way through quickly, and it's something you begin to feel into. And that can feel unfamiliar, because it's a different direction. Instead of looking outward, you're beginning to look inward, not to blame yourself, not to make it your fault, but to understand what's being activated inside you. And this isn't something most people are taught to do, so it can feel uncertain, like you're stepping into something you don't fully understand yet. But there's also something quietly recognizable about it. Because when you ask that question, what is being touched in me, you might feel a shift, not a clear answer, not a solution, but a sense that you're closer to something real. And that's where the direction changes. Not away from the moment, but deeper into it, not trying to control it, but trying to understand what's underneath it. And that's where something new begins to open. And if you stay with that question just a little longer, what is being touched in me? You might notice that the answer doesn't come as a thought. It comes as a feeling and something in your body, something in your chest, something in your stomach, or the sensation that's already there before you can explain it. And that feeling might not be new. It might carry a familiarity that's hard to describe. Not because you've thought about it before, but because you've felt it before. I mean, other moments, in other situations, maybe not in the same way, but with the same tone, the same underlying sense. And that's where it begins to feel different. Whereas because now you're not just looking at what's happening, you're noticing how something inside you is responding. And that response has a depth to it. It's not just about the moment. It's not just about the words. It carries something that feels older, something that doesn't fully belong to what's happening right now. And this can be unsettling because it means that what you're feeling isn't only about the present, it's connected to something you haven't fully seen yet. And that can create a hesitation, a sense of not knowing exactly where to go next. Because the usual way of understanding things doesn't quite reach it. You can't think your way through it in the same way. And that can feel uncertain. But if you stay even just for a moment longer, without needing to resolve it, without needing to name it, something begins to become clearer. And once you begin to sense that there is something underneath, that something that's being touched again and again, another shift begins. Because now it's not just a question of what's happening. It becomes a question of what keeps getting activated, and that can feel both clear and unclear at the same time. Clear in the sense that you can feel it, but unclear because you can't quite put it into words. And that's often how this layer appears, not as something obvious, not as something you can explain, but as something you recognize without fully understanding, a feeling that arrives quickly and carries a weight to it, something like not being seen, not being heard, not being understood, or a sense that something isn't safe even when nothing outwardly dangerous is happening. And those feelings don't come from nowhere. They have a depth to them, a kind of history that isn't always visible, but is very present in how they're felt. And this is where it becomes easier to see why the same moments can feel so intense. Because what's being touched is not just the situation. It's something that already carries meaning, like something that already matters before the moment even begins. And that meaning shapes everything, how you hear what's being said, how you interpret it, how you respond to it. And once that meaning is in place, it's very hard to step outside of it. Why? Because it feels true. Not as an idea, but as an experience. And when something feels true, it doesn't ask to be questioned. It asks to be followed. And that's what happens. You follow it through your words, through your reactions, through your tone. And the other person feels that, even if they don't understand it, even if they can't name it, they feel the weight of it. Something in them responds. And now both of you are inside something that is much bigger than what's actually happening. And this is where the pattern becomes stronger, because now it's not just behavior, it's meaning. And meaning holds things in place, and it gives direction to how everything unfolds. And that's why changing the surface doesn't always change the experience, because the surface is not where the direction is coming from. It's coming from underneath, from what something means when it lands. And that meaning is not always conscious. It doesn't always come as a clear thought. It often arrives as a feeling that carries its own logic, when that logic feels convincing, and because it's familiar, because it's been there in other moments, in other situations, and that familiarity makes it feel like the only way to understand what's happening. But once you begin to see that, once you begin to notice that meaning is forming very quickly underneath the moment, something else becomes possible, not immediately, not completely, but gradually. A space begins to open between what happens and what it comes to mean. And in that space, there is something different, not a solution, not an answer, but the beginning of seeing that what's happening is not only what it seems. And once you begin to see that something underneath is shaping how moments are experienced, another question begins to form. Not just why does this happen, but why does it keep happening? Even when you see it, even when you try to change it. And this is where something important comes into view, because what repeats is not always what you choose. It's often what feels most familiar, and familiarity has a quiet pull to it. Even when it doesn't feel good, even when it creates frustration, even when part of you knows this isn't what you want, there's something about it that feels known. And that sense of knowing has a kind of stability to it. You understand it, you know how it moves, you know what comes next. And that predictability can feel safer, not safe in a comfortable way, but safe in a recognizable way. And that distinction matters because the body often responds more to what is known than to what is comfortable. So even when something hurts, if it's familiar, it can still feel easier to stay with than something you don't yet understand. And this is where the pattern holds. Not because you want it to, but because it fits with something you already know. And that can show up in subtle ways, in how quickly you return to a certain reaction, in how easily a familiar feeling takes over, in how something seems to follow a path you recognize even when you try to move it differently. And this doesn't mean you're choosing it, it means something in you recognizes it. And recognition is powerful, why it creates a sense of certainty. Even when that certainty isn't helpful, and so the pattern continues, not because it's right, not because it's what you want, but because it's what feels most known. And this is where something else becomes clear, that moving away from that doesn't just mean changing behavior, it means stepping into something unfamiliar, and that can feel uncertain, even if that unfamiliar space holds something better. It doesn't feel better at first. It feels unknown, and the unknown can feel more uncomfortable than something you already understand. And this is where many people return, not consciously, not as a decision, but as a movement back into something that feels more certain, even if it doesn't feel good. And that's why patterns can continue for so long, because they're not just habits. They're ways of staying with what feels known. And that can be hard to see because it doesn't feel like staying. It feels like being pulled, like something is happening again. But underneath that, there's a kind of alignment between what you feel and what you already recognize. And that alignment holds the pattern in place until something shifts in how you meet it. And once you begin to see that what repeats is not just the situation, but something in how it's experienced, something else becomes possible, not as a solution, not as a way of fixing it, but as a different place to stand. Well, because instead of trying to change what's happening or control how it unfolds, you begin to notice how you're inside it. And that's a very different movement, because it doesn't start with the other person. It doesn't start with the situation. Like, it starts with what you feel as it's happening. And that can be subtle because the habit is to move quickly, to react, to respond, to adjust, to protect. And all of that happens before there's much space to notice anything else. But if something in you has begun to see how the pattern moves, there can be a moment, however small, and that moment, even if it's brief, is different. Because now you're not completely inside it. There's something in you that can see and feel at the same time. And from there, things begin to shift in ways that don't need to be forced. So you don't need to hold on to this. You don't need to remember it perfectly. Just notice when something feels familiar, when something tightens, when something begins to move, and see if there's even a small moment where you can stay, not to fix it, not to change it, just to be there as it unfolds, because that is where something new begins. And even if that moment is small, even if it passes quickly, it still matters, because it shows you that something in you is already beginning to see differently. If something in this episode resonated with you, you can explore more at www.theplayfulcouple.co.uk. And if something has stirred your curiosity and you'd like to explore it further, feel free to get in touch.